All right, so let's get going. So talking about women. So remember, we're talking about the effects of the Revolutionary War on women. Now, in terms of what's going to happen with these women, is remember, let's see if you remember this vocab term, is during the American Revolution and following the American Revolution, women are going to want to break away from? There you go. If you got cult of domesticity, you're going to do great in this class because we talk about it every single unit. So they're going to break away from that cult of domesticity, or the idea that women's jobs is to make babies, stay home, and teach those girl babies to make more babies. Now we're actually going to want to have more and more rights. And this is going to start with this women's rights right here. Now, one example of kind of showing how women felt following the American Revolution has to do with these two. On the left, we have Abigail Adams, and on the right, I just drew on this. Don't tell anybody. And on the right, we have John Adams, the original John Adams, not John Quincy Adams, who's going to be one of our first presidents. Now, you have to realize back then, especially for high-profile marriages, political marriages, celebrity marriages, it was an arranged marriage. You were put together for political power or for possibly wealth. And typically, she would live in the home all by herself. The husband would go around to wherever he's going to be traveling. If he ever comes home, he typically has a separate wing of the house that he stays in. They don't sleep in the same bed. Oftentimes, mistresses are coming in and out with no problem whatsoever. So Abigail Adams doesn't necessarily have any love for her husband. So she decides to write him a nice little note over a 2-week time period. And basically, this is what this note is going to say. It's a very famous note. Now, I want to point out a couple of things on this. And if you actually flip your paper to the very back, it is also your first sourcing. Now, due to time, we're not going to have you guys individually read it. But I'm going to point out some things that are kind of really stark about this individual one. So we're going to kind of skip around in it. So when she's talking about this code of law, she's talking about the new Constitution. So it says, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies. Remember the female parts of your country. Now, she starts to get very specific about how she feels about the male gender. For example, she says, remember all men would be tyrants if they could. That's really positive thinking, huh? All men are tyrants. They're all awful people. She actually goes through here and says that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth. So you guys, naturally, when you are born as the male gender, are tyrannical, right? Is she pro or anti-male kind of in this? Kind of anti, right? She's really frustrated. It's not necessarily that she hates men, but she hates the fact that women are not as equal as men. She actually continues to go along where she actually says here, but such as you as wish to be happy, willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. You no longer have to be the master of this house. Why can't we just be equal parts of this relationship? And this is what is called remember the ladies. So on your piece of paper where it says woman, things that I would highlight on here is next to Abigail Adams, I would highlight remember the ladies. This is going to be the call to the beginning of feminism. So even if you write next to woman, if you want to put start feminism, this is going to be the beginning of feminism pretty much in America. Now, this is going to succeed in what is known as Republican motherhood. One second. So, with Republican motherhood, this is a starred term. And what I would highlight in this section is I would highlight better education, starting at better, and highlight the rest of that bullet. So starting at better, all the way through society. Basically what they're going to believe is that women should get an education. And this is a huge deal. Before, women were not even allowed to learn how to read and write. Now we're going to give them an education. But here's the catch. You're not just getting an education, you're specifically getting one to help your husbands and your sons become better political members of society. So while, yes, it expands women's rights, who's it really for? The men, right? So a little bit of a double standard here. Now, what this leads to is the creation of women's colleges. Basically, this is completely different than a traditional men's college. Before, when men go to college, they're going to learn varieties of languages. They're going to learn sciences and history and math. Women don't learn that. Women are going to learn Latin, because Latin is going to be how you read the Bible. You're going to learn French, because that was considered a very dainty language back then, which was acceptable for women. If women were to go and learn German or Spanish, that was actually seen as a manly language, so it would be too harsh for the delicate women to learn. So they would learn French instead. They would learn homemaking. They would learn anything to be a good wife and how to be able to help your kids be better political members of society. Now, is this a double standard? Yes, right? Women are going to continue to get more and more rights, but instead it's actually helping the male population rather than the women. Again, key term on this one. So now we're going to start to change our American Constitution and our government system. Now, in the beginning, we have the Articles of Confederation, which is a double star, extremely important term. Definitely going to be asked on the AP exam. Now, things that I would highlight in this bullet is I would highlight established a loose confederation of largely independent states, and then highlight limited powers. So basically, we didn't want a tyranny. We did not want a kingship. By doing this, we're going to create the Articles of Confederation. Basically, this creates an extremely weak system of government, a weak alliance of states. So we're kind of together, but do our own thing. A great example is the Social Studies department, right? You've probably taken before geography, world history, anything along those lines. So we have this whole department of about 15 teachers. Well, we are a confederation of a department for social studies, but we all do our own thing, right? So I teach differently than Mr. Kruger and Mr. Cater and Mr. Reed. All of those are going to be different, but we're still kind of together. So do you see how we're together, but we work independently? That's how this works right here. And it's going to be extremely, extremely weak. Now, for the AP exam, you need to know the positives and the negatives, and you need to be able to identify the differences. So even if in this like little blank area, if you want to kind of make a bullet to yourself, because I know that the negatives aren't until the next page, to know the positives and negatives, and be able to give examples of those positives and negatives. This was actually the required SAQ 2 years ago, and also the required DBQ 2 years ago. They had a DBQ on the Revolution, and they had an SAQ on the Articles. So this is a definite must-know. Also last year, one of the LEQs was also on the American Revolution. So this is something that you really, really need to know. So we're going to start with positives, and make sure you understand that the negatives far outweigh the positives, but we have to get you some sort of a positive. Now you have the traditional no king, no tyranny, and things like that, but there is one term that you must associate as a positive, and that is the Northwest Ordinance. So next to the Northwest Ordinance, you should put most important positive. Extremely, extremely important, because this is the one that they want you to say on the AP exam. So the Northwest Ordinance is going to create the Northwest Territory. So if you want to go ahead and highlight Northwest Territory so you know what that's coming from. It's basically the Ohio River Valley, but now it's going to actually be founded. And then star the third bullet. Star the third bullet where it says provided for public schools. So let me explain how this looks. So this is after the Revolutionary War. America already has the 13 original colonies. Once we have now defeated Britain, we now have this new conquered territory. How are we going to start to go into this? We have Native Americans. Remember, now we're breaking the proclamation line. How are we going to settle this in a productive manner? So this actually becomes an extremely well put together system. Basically, what they're going to do is in this Ohio River Valley, they're going to separate these into states. Every state gets further divided into what is known as a range. Think of it as like a county. Then they're going to subdivide it even more into a township. And then once more into what is called a section, which is basically a plot that you can personally buy. This pretty much, in theory, creates the county, the city, and the house section of our cities that we have today. Now, what this does is a couple things. Number one, there's no more conflicts over who owns the land because we have specifically made it. Now, take away Native Americans because, as usual, we're going to just take that land from them. But in this case, we're able to actually say, you now get this section of Section 2 or whatever it could possibly be. It's very formal. But the most important thing that this does is it creates laws in this territory. In particular, free public education to everybody up until the 6th grade. It also, this is very important, is slavery. No longer can slavery be allowed. It becomes our first law against slavery in the United States. But we now need to head to the negatives. Okay? Negatives are going to be the ones that are extremely important. This is an absolute must-know because you have to know why we needed a new government system in America. So we're going to be going over the negatives of the Constitution. Confederation. I'm sorry. I put my pen somewhere. Do you see it? Thank you. Okay, so negatives of the Articles of Confederation. This is why we had to create a brand new government. So, things that I would star. I would star Shays' Rebellion. I would then star Central Government Weak. I would star financial problems, but in particular, do like a little arrow to the side, and in a box, write the word taxation, and kind of box it around, and make sure you know that there was no ability to tax. So taxation, there's none of it. No ability to tax during this time. Now, in terms of the reason why taxation was such a big problem, if you think about today, imagine if we had no taxes in American society. Why that's a big problem? Number one, no more schools, because those are funded by taxes. Roads don't exist anymore. Most of the jobs that, if you guys have any parents that work for the government, is now gone because we don't have the ability to pay them. Without taxes, our government system cannot run. Well, that was a problem back then. We were in massive amounts of debts, and we have no money to run a government. Now, there are two events that kind of show why this is going to be such a problem. And the first one is going to be what's known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. The thing that I would highlight in this section is going to be pensions. Just the word pensions should remind you of what this word means. Now, if you guys remember back in the Revolutionary War, we had a bunch of soldiers, right? And remember, we couldn't afford to pay them because we were trying to fight. And so we told them we're going to give you an IOU and we will pay you back later. Well, here's the problem. If you don't have taxes, can you pay these people?
No, probably not.
No, it's impossible, right? You can't pay somebody if you have no money. And so what happens is they have to come up with a taxation. Now, back then, you actually had to have every single one of the states agree to a tax. Imagine if in today's society of Republicans and Democrats and separation of states, if we were to come up with a solution to, let's say, universal health care, medical marijuana, gay marriage, imagine if every single state had to agree to pass a law. It would never happen, right? It'd be impossible. And so this is what's going to happen back there. But they have so many people upset that they're not getting paid, that they are finally going to pass a tax law. Well, here's the problem, is that this is going to really affect certain people. And in particular, it's going to affect something that creates Shays' Rebellion. Now, this is a starred term. Starred term. You need to know and highlight poor white farmers in the third bullet. Now, they are able to raise taxes to be able to fund this pension program. Well, on the coast and in the ports, those are where the rich people live, right? Because that's where the trading happens. But outside, in the farming realms, is you're going to have a problem that these guys cannot pay these taxes. It's almost 70% of their income. They don't have the ability to even pay for food themselves, let alone pay this tax, and they're about to lose their home, so they are going to riot. Now, when they go and riot, they're going to begin to have violence. They begin to tar and feather again, just like pre-Revolutionary War. And the government now has to stop it. Now, here's the problem, though. The government decides to take away a bunch of liberties of its people in order to solve this problem. And this is passed through what's known as the Riot Act, which basically says this. Number one, you cannot be in a public place with more than 10 people in it. Number two, habeas corpus is now suspended. That means that you can be arrested without being charged with a crime. You can be convicted without ever going in front of a judge or a jury. You are not allowed to have a lawyer. It takes away all of your civil liberties. And now people are angry. The Articles forced this taxation and is now taking away individual rights. We now know that we need a new form of government. Which brings us to the Constitution. Now, as a quick pause away from APUSH, I've had a couple of people ask me this question, so I just want to clarify it. We've had quite a few students ask me about what the word sovereign citizens mean. Now, sovereign citizens, which you might have seen on YouTube videos, Facebook, Twitter, cop shows all the time, basically it's people who kind of publicly show that they do not trust some of the laws of the government or the people of the government. Now, when we have laws that are created, basically any new law does what's called superseding, which means it goes over another law that's already created if it changes it. So a great example is happening in Utah right now. One of the laws that somebody is trying to pass is if you've ever been at like a red light at, let's say, 2 or 3 in the morning, when no cars are coming, but you're sitting there for forever waiting for the light to change. They're trying to create a law that says after 2 minutes you can proceed through that light as long as nobody's coming, even though you're at a red light. Now, are there also laws that say you have to stop at a stoplight every time? Mm-hmm. Yes. So what this does is while both laws apply, you still have to stop at stoplights, it supersedes the other in certain circumstances. Now, what happens is when we want to repeal laws, laws are very, very expensive to repeal. In fact, even a small law can take up to $5 million just to take that law out of commission. That's not even creating a new law. The average law created takes about $20 million worth of work. And so the problem is a lot of taxpayers don't want to have to pay for that law to be repealed. So this is why if you guys have ever heard of like the funny laws, like you can't tie a whale to a telephone pole, or you can't buy over 50 pounds of chocolate at one time, or all these different weird laws. You guys have seen those. It's like stupid laws on the internet. There's a reason those laws still exist, and it's because it's so expensive to repeal them. So because of this, the Articles of Confederation were never actually repealed. While they were replaced by the Constitution, they were never actually taken away. And so what sovereign citizens believe is that the Articles of Confederation are the law of the land and not the Constitution, so they only follow that. The most famous example is where they say they have the right to travel, which means they believe that they don't have to have a driver's license, register their car, or have car insurance. So just to let you know, if you ever have somebody, it's a really big upswing in college where they say, I'm going to be a sovereign citizen and go fight the law. You can totally go fight the law and go do this. Just understand it is illegal and you will be arrested. So you can fight the law all you want, but it is still definitely illegal. And it hasn't changed. There's been lawsuits. It's not going to change. Make sense? I had a couple kids ask me that. Yeah?
Is it more expensive to repeal a law or to install it?
Definitely to install.
Why does it cost so much?
Why does it cost so much to repeal the law? Because of the fact that, number one, is you have to actually come together and say why we should have to repeal the law. You now have to change the actual Constitution or the laws of the state of Utah, which means you have to reprint all the books that are law books. So every year, the Utah laws are printed into a book. You can find it at the Utah State court system. And they have to just change things. A great example is UTA. So you guys know tracks and stuff, Utah Transit Authority. This year, they wanted to change the name of that because they wanted to rebrand it as a more positive name. They estimate that the cost to rebrand and change everything in the state of Utah, not only to enforce or put the law into place, but it would have cost about $60 to $80 million to change the name to rebrand. It's part of the reason it was squashed. So things take a lot of money just to change that. Even something as simple as about 2 or 3 years ago, there was an elementary school in Ogden that wanted to change the state tree, and they succeeded that. They contacted their representatives, and the state of Utah changed the state tree. That still costs a couple $1 million because now you have to change education about what our state tree is. Up at, if you don't know this, the U.S. Capitol has every room is named after a state something, whether it be a state bird, a state dinosaur. They now have to change that room. They have to change the maps and the layouts of the state capitol. A lot of things come when you change a law. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I believe it's the Colorado spruce. Because I remember it was a huge, and how I know this, why it was a big deal, because I had a meeting up at the Capitol for social studies teachers, and the maps weren't changed yet, so we were put until I think it used to be the aspen. It was either the aspen to the spruce or the spruce to aspen, but the room hadn't been changed yet on the maps, so we didn't know where to go, because they have to redo the whole system at the U.S. Capitol. So every map has to be reprinted, the giant map that shows where to go has to be reprinted, everything has to change. A lot of things to change a law. Okay, so we're now going to create the U.S. Constitution, though, and we're going to come together at the Constitutional Convention to do so. Now, in the second bullet of the Constitutional Convention, this, by the way, was not to replace the articles. In fact, they actually just went to fix it, and then they end up changing it in the space of 2 months. Now, what they're going to create, and what you need to highlight in the second bullet, which is a very important bullet, you need to do created and I would just highlight, limited but central government, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then next to the word federalism, if you will write the number 1, that is the first example of a limited but central government. And then number 2, next to separation of powers between branches. So we have a centralized government, right? We have like the federal government, Donald Trump, Congress, stuff like that. But the reality is that they do not have all the power in the world. They can't just make decisions. They can't all of a sudden say every single person in America must go to bed by 8 p.m., right? They can't just say things and make it happen. You actually have to go through a process. Now, this is how we limit our government. So for the first example of federalism is the idea that we have both federal and state powers. So while the federal government can do things, your state can also do things. So it gives power to the big, brother government is what some people call it. And with states' rights people, they say we need rights here in our state of Utah because they care about us more here, and they have powers too. The second thing is what is known as the separation of powers. This is the idea that we have 3 branches. The legislative branch creates the laws, the executive branch executes the laws, that's the president, and the judicial branch makes sure those laws are actually legal. Now, this is very important to make sure that our laws are constitutional law. This is what happened with our gay marriage laws. It goes up. A lot of our states have created laws, including here in the state of Utah. It was actually in our state constitution that men and women are the only people that can get married. It said in there that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, when this all gets sued and goes up to the Supreme Court, they now have to decide, is that constitutional? They determined it was unconstitutional, which is why gay marriage is now legal. Now, this happens all the time with different laws. Obamacare was challenged. Is Obamacare legal according to our Constitution? They found it was legal. So all these different things check each other and limits our big government. Now, we have 2 different groups of people that are going to... by the way, this all happens in Independence Hall. I think one of you in this class said you're going to Philadelphia in a couple of weeks. So if you're going to Independence Hall, this is where the Constitution was, and you can, experience that. The Constitution, or the Independence Hall Constitutional Convention, had about 350 delegates. This Independence Hall is about the size of this room. So imagine 350 people trying to get together in this room and write a constitution in the matter of only 2 months. Very, very difficult for them. What? 40 is yeah. Well, this class has 44. We have a lot of people here. But because of this, some people actually didn't even come. So some of our really famous people that are going to be our famous people of the Declaration of Independence didn't even show up because they felt like, why do we actually need a new government? We already have one. But regardless, they're going to try to fix this. And these 2 terms should sound familiar, yes? Because you all did homework on it, so at least some of this should be familiar. Some of you are like, nope, because I didn't do it. Well, you'll learn today. So we're going to go through each of these quickly and highlight the things that you will want to know. And hopefully you did these in your assignment. If not, and you flip them, that's unfortunate, but hopefully you did this correctly. So on the Federalist, next to the word Federalist, you need to put pro-Constitution. They advocated for the passage of the U.S. Constitution. You need to star the first bullet. Highlight Alexander Hamilton. And then star the bullet that says the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalists believed that we had to have a strong central government. If we don't have a strong central government, our entire environment is just going to go into chaos. So, for example, let's think of at this school, let's pretend that we have a zombie apocalypse. And this school is the only thing that exists in the entire world. And luckily you guys were here, so good job going to school that day. But unfortunately, all of your teachers, all of your administrators, unfortunately, are now zombies because they got bit. So you guys have to create your own government. Now, if you've ever seen any movie where somebody gets stranded, well, now we're getting a little bit more complicated. We'll just pretend that the zombies can't come in here and you're all going to live a blissful life with unlimited food and resources at the school. Yes. Now, if you've seen any movie about being stranded or TV show like Lost or anything along the lines, they usually start with no government, right? We're all friends. We all want to survive. No big deal. As resources begin to become scarce, what do people start to do to each other?
Kill each other.
Kill each other. That's when the bodies show up, right? What? Because you have, that's what happens when you kill each other, bodies show up.
We would hide the bodies better.
Okay, well, I think you're going a little more complicated into this made-up event. Okay. You have unlimited food until it stops. Okay, anyways. So, what I'm trying to say, though, is as we begin to compete, or even as we begin to fight over little small things, bodies begin to pile up. We begin to have disagreements. No laws creates complete chaos. We saw this over in Egypt back in 2011. Egypt ended up having a civil war against their government, and Egypt for about 9 months was in complete chaos. They went through 26 presidents in that 9-month period. Pretty much all of them are dead. And the reason why is because there was just complete chaos because there was no laws. Now, this is what they're trying to prevent. Pro-law, pro-constitution, pro-government, because we need to have security and control. The anti-federalists are going to be anti to all this. Get it? Alright, anyways. So, anti-federalists are going to be against the Constitution. Now, this does not mean that they did not want a government. This means that they just were against the idea of having a big, strong central government. So this is kind of the idea of states' rights. We don't want a big, huge government because we already have a government in our states. Who better to know us than the state of Utah? So this is the idea of a small government that kind of helps us, but really it's the states. So things that you're going to want to highlight or star on this one. In the second bullet, you can star the second bullet, but I want you to highlight the words national taxes. Why would we have taxation if we just fought a whole war over Britain over taxing us? That's the idea. We shouldn't even have taxes. We should only pay taxes to our individual states. You need to star the third bullet. That's basically the definition. A weak alliance. And if you will also, in the third to last, if you would highlight individual or rights of individual sovereign states. This right here is states' rights. Now, based on what we know about states' rights and maybe what you've known previously about states' rights, the anti-federalists, are they going to be northern or southern states? Southern, right? A lot of this has to do with, and if you'll put it in this box, it all has to do with slavery. A lot of this has to do with the idea that if we have a bigger government, now they're going to constrict slavery, and we can't have that happen. So on the opposite side, the Federalists, are they going to be the North or the South? The North, right? They have the money. They don't need to worry about restrictions because they're going to be just fine. And this is going to be really, really big during these two time periods. Now, the Federalist Papers, if you will write next to this sourcing, this is going to be a sourcing that you will probably see on the AP exam for a pro-Constitution. So if you put sourcing pro-Constitution, they want to pass the Constitution. So Alexander Hamilton in particular, as well as a bunch of other guys, are going to create about 300 different papers of why we should pass the Constitution and why it's important. It works, and we're going to pass the U.S. Constitution. But we still have a little bit of problem. And this is going to come, how do we represent people in Congress? If we want to make laws, how are we going to figure this out? So if you can see by this map, this is taking modern-day U.S. populations and separating them into 13 individual districts based on population.
It's just like the Hunger Games.
It actually is. That's why this was created.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This was created, so what this actually is somebody thought with the Hunger Games, what are, based on the books and the different districts, where each of the districts would be, which is why District 1 is in LA, because it's considered the one of the richest places in the world. Simply because of some people who have massive amounts of wealth there. It also includes Silicon Valley, so you're going to have Apple in District 1. Congratulations. But anyways, so this is separating us into individual districts. Now the fear of doing it by population is, if you know anything about LA, you know that LA is extremely Democrat. In fact, I don't think they've ever not voted Democrat, maybe once with Ronald Reagan, but they are very, very, very Democrat. In contrast, the same population of these states, which is about 10 states, are very Republican states. Now the idea becomes, should little LA up to San Francisco, should they be allowed to have the same impact as 9 giant states, right? That's what the question is going to become. How do we represent people in Congress? And this is going to come down to these 2 plans. Now really quick, wait. Before you rotate, I forgot to have you do one thing. On the Federalist and Anti-Federalist box, if you will kind of like highlight the border of that box and say like must know, this is a must know thing for the AP exam. And even if you start and you put have to know, we did have some people on the quiz realize when they went back and missed stuff, they looked back at their notes and they had must know and they were like, oh, that's why I missed it, because I didn't study it. Study that for sure. And then this next box, the constitutional plans, this is also a must-know set of boxes. Must-know set of boxes. Now, you need to know the differences between the 2 plans. Now, we're going to start with Virginia plan. I've kind of already highlighted the major things that you need to know, but you need to highlight in the second bullet, members elected by population. The fancy word for that is proportional representation. What this means is that your representation in Congress is based on population, which makes sense. Let me give you an example here in class. Let's pretend that I suddenly won the lottery and I decided to bring all my students on a vacation.
Sweet.
Yay, and I'm paying for it. Yay. Now this class has 44 students in it. In comparison, one of my U.S. history classes has 25 students, right? So let's pretend that your 2 classes are going to decide where we go. We decide to vote. My other class, decide they're going to go to Italy. Yay. This class, though, is going to go really big, and you guys are going to go to Vernal. Yay. Guess what? According to the Virginia plan, you guys, because you have more people in it, you make us go to Vernal instead of going to Italy. Now, this is the idea of proportional representation. This is where you get where in Congress, depending on how many states are Republican or Democrat, you control Congress and the House of Representatives. So, for example, right now we have a Republican-dominated House of Representatives. What that means is that more representatives, based on population, are going to be voting for more Republican things. A lot of things right now look like it's going to switch to Democrat in November, so we'll see if that happens. But it all depends on this representation. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the Virginia plan. Now, the Virginia plan is going to be that second bullet. Equal representations among all states.
You mean New Jersey plan?
New Jersey plan, sorry. What did I say?
Virginia.
I don't know. It's really late, and it should be the weekend, in my opinion, by now, so my mind's a little off. So these are going to cater to the small states. So if you think about it, a lot of people here in Utah don't love the idea of voting in the presidential election because they say, what does it matter? We only have a few little electors. We don't make a difference. Compare that to like South Dakota and North Dakota who have 2 each, right? Do they even matter compared to something like California with 53? Now, that means that we're going to have our own representation, no matter how big or how small we are. Everybody is exactly the same. Now, what this is going to combine into is the Great Compromise. Now, one thing I want you to put, by the way, next to Virginia plan, you need to make sure that this is going to appeal to the large states, in particular Virginia. The people with the most population want the most representation in Congress. Now, why do you think Virginia in particular has the most population according to them?
Slavery.
Slavery, and that's what you need to write in that box. You are on top of it today. Okay, you need to write in that box slavery. That's why they wanted this. At the time in Virginia, about 80% of the population are slaves. You have more slaves, more population. That means you have more of an impact in Congress. On the other side, you have the New Jersey plan. Make sure you know that that is the small states. The little guys are going to want a little bit of representation. Now, in order to compromise and come together, they are going to pass what is known as the Great Compromise, which is a double star, very important term. The Great Compromise. There is one little error, though, that I need to correct that somebody noticed last class, because apparently I was tired when I wrote this. In the first bullet on the far right, where it says combines both Virginia and Connecticut plan, you need to change the word Connecticut to New Jersey. Even if you just put NJ. Basically, you need to know that we are going to combine these two. So what's going to happen is we're going to create two different houses of Congress. Next to Virginia plan, if you will write that that is going to become, what is it going to become if it's going to be based on proportionality, as in more population? The House of Representatives. Good. So next to Virginia plan, or in the... You doing okay?
Yeah.
If you die in class, we have to rename the classroom after you, and that's going to be complicated. You good? Need some water? Okay, awesome. If you need to step out for a second, just let me know.
How about we just name the robot after you instead?
We could name the robot after you. That could be fun. Lots of options. Okay, if you put next to it House of Representatives. House of Representatives has 435 representatives from each of the states. Bigger states like California and Texas have the most. Smaller states like North and South Dakota and Wyoming have the least amount of representatives. On the opposite side, the New Jersey plan, what is that going to become? The Senate. So make sure you know that that is going to become the Senate. Everybody gets the same amount of representation. 2 senators per state. Most of the states are going to be 1 Democrat and 1 Republican. That is why here in Utah it is such a big deal going on right now. Orrin Hatch, who is the longest running senator right now, he's very, very important in the Senate. He's probably one of the most important people in the Senate. He is retiring. So we have a huge race going on right now of who's going to take that seat. We have Mitt Romney, who's on the Republican side. And on the other side, we have a Democrat. It'll be really interesting. I think Mitt Romney will probably win. We'll see. But we have the 2 sides going off of that 1 seat. Huh? Well, here's why I'll say a couple things. Number 1, just take away the word Mitt Romney and have the word Republican there. And that's part of the reason why. And number 2, the Democrat has been pretty vocal on a lot of things. She's gone to the news for a lot of things, and a lot of people find that a little bit polarizing. So, for example, 2 days ago, she said that once she's elected into Congress, she would impeach the president. That really segregates people here in the state based on that political beliefs. Hold on. I have to look it up. I knew it yesterday, but it's blanking from my head. It's a woman. She's also very young. Compared to Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, I think, is like 55, 60. She's somewhere around 40 years old, which is pretty young compared to. Yeah.
Who's the Democrat?
That's what she just asked.
Nobody knows.
If somebody, okay. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So we'll see what happens in the election. They're actually pretty close to each other. I think it's only about 2% off with Mitt Romney in the lead. That's not a lot. Also, Ben McAdams versus Mia Love. That's the other big one that'll happen this fall. Okay, anyways. So that's going to create those 2 different sections. So the Great Compromise is going to end up creating our new Constitution, and it's not going to be passed. Now, if you see the word James Madison, know that he is going to be your person that's going to be what's known as the father of the Constitution. He's going to be the one that writes all the pages of the Constitution. Hand writes, by the way. There's no typing back then. And there's about 120 pages of the original Constitution. So he had a lot of time on his hands. But regardless, he's going to be the father of the Constitution. But here's a fun fact that we will learn next class. About 2 years later, he actually switches to be an anti-federalist. So he writes the U.S. Constitution. 2 years later, he's going to be anti-Constitution. And we'll learn about that next class period. A lot of it has to do with the fact that it's like one of those things of, is it a good thing what I created for the world? A great example is with Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein's theory was used to create the atomic bomb. And then Albert Einstein later said, that he regrets allowing them to use his theory to be able to create the atomic bombs. So, yeah, that's what happened with James Madison. We'll talk about that next class. So anyways, this is going to create our U.S. Constitution, which is what we're going to talk about. One more slide, and then we're going to get to current events. Okay? So, things you need to know for the Bill of Rights. First off, for a push, as much as I would love for you guys to memorize all 27 of the U.S. amendments, you only need to know about 9 of them. In the Bill of Rights, which are going to be your first 10 amendments, you need to know, and I would bracket these amendments. 1st, 2nd, 9th, and 10th. These are going to be the ones that are going to be the most important and most commonly referenced on the AP exam. And then on the last bullet, you need to highlight the very first line, almost all of it. Federalists assured the ratification of the Constitution by promising the addition of the Bill of Rights. If the Bill of Rights had not been added, the Constitution likely would have never passed. And the reason why, if you will underline it, you can underline established individual rights and restricted the powers of the federal government. This is why it was passed. Federalists did not want a Bill of Rights. They did not want to protect individual rights because they wanted the government to have all the power. The Anti-Federalists say, no, we must have individual rights and create the Bill of Rights. In modern day terms, the Federalists nowadays would probably be considered the Democrats, and the Anti-Federalists would probably be the Republicans. Okay? So now let's get into the fun stuff. Okay? Because you might want to say, well, why does this matter? How does this affect my life? So we're going to talk about these 4 amendments and why they're so important. Now, before we start, slight little ground rules about a couple things. Right now in Utah and America, we are a bit polarized on our political beliefs. So some of you might have one belief, and some of you might have another. Important things is, number 1, we want to make sure that whether verbally or non-verbally, we are respectful to everybody, which means, for example, if somebody disagrees with you, and we had this happen yesterday, don't sit there under your breath and say, you're so dumb, or you're so stupid, or in that case, there was some swear words involved. Okay? We don't want that to happen. So what that means, we just need to be respectful, and even if you have a comment that disagrees, there's a difference between saying a comment in an educated, question way or statement way, rather than just saying, you suck. Okay? Make sense? Always say when you're having political arguments, know what you're talking about. Don't just say you're dumb or whatever it could be, because then there's a whole bunch of problems that come with it. Okay? So we're going to go through a couple of these amendments and why they're so important. So we're going to start with the First Amendment right here. Speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition. These last 2 are really important, especially the assembly, because most people don't know what this word means. Assembly basically means you are allowed to have a protest and assemble together. Remember that riot act we talked about where they said more than 10 people can't be in public together? You now have the right to assemble. So do you guys remember last year in April when we had all the walkouts? Right? And one of the walkouts, they went out to the Capitol and they did what's called a die-in, which is where they all laid on the floor of the U.S. Capitol. As long as you apply for a permit, which has nothing to do with political beliefs, it actually is a protection issue because they want to make sure that you're protected and people around you. So that's why they will have cops at these protests. It's not to restrict you, but it's violence. A great example that happens every year is the Gay Pride Parade. There's always somebody that disagrees with that protest, and it always results in violence. That's why the permits are there, to make sure they have the security that's needed to protect both parties. But that was permitted up there, so it's completely allowed as long as you don't break the rules. So you can't go say, I'm going to go assemble and do a protest and do drugs in the park. Okay, that's not what we're saying. You can't just assemble to assemble. You have to still follow the laws in the state. Petition is really interesting right now. Donald Trump did tweet a couple days ago that he thinks we should take this out of the U.S. Constitution.
The First Amendment? Or?
The petition. And remember, don't just say it's insane.
That is
an interesting
idea.
This is an interesting idea from the president. Now, So, it has a lot to do with right now the NFL protests and a lot of the protests against himself. Here's the one thing that I will tell you. The big thing that's happening right now is, if you don't know, we are in the process right now of affirming a new Supreme Court justice. Supreme Court justices are in there for life, which means that person could be on that court system for 30, 40 years.
Or until they retire.
Or until they retire, which it depends on which one they do. But regardless, they're going to be there a long time. So that decision is very important. What's happened is that a lot of people, because you are allowed, the public's allowed to go and view it, there's been a lot of protests there. And based on those protests, as well as some of the NFL protests with the kneeling and things like that, that's the comment that he made. But regardless, so let's talk about how this affects your guys' lives as teenagers. And we'll start with the freedom of religion. Now, let me give you an example of where this might come in. So this girl right here in the top right, she wanted to go apply for a store called Abercrombie & Fitch, which I know is not very popular anymore, but back when I was in high school, everybody wore that clothing. And so when she was wanting a good job in high school, she goes to apply and she gets the job. Yay! They say you're awesome, positive attitude, we think you're going to be a great fit, but we have a little problem. You see, you wear a hijab, which if you notice is her head covering that most Islamic women wear, but it is a choice based on personal preference. Now the issue is that Abercrombie & Fitch had a no hat policy. So they told her that the problem is that because she was wearing this, that is considered a hat, and she would have to take it off to be able to work there. She sues, it goes all the way up to the federal court, and they say that is a violation of their individual rights. Abercrombie & Fitch lost that lawsuit. Now, there are limits, though, to religious freedoms. For example, you are able to create any religion that you want, but that doesn't mean you can do illegal things. So, for example, and you're going to probably laugh at this, but I'll give you an example of why this is prevalent. You can't create a religion that believes in killing people. And if you say, that would never happen, well, we just had one that was a compound down in New Mexico that wanted to commit the largest school shooting in American history in order to be able to be saved. And so you can't do that and break the law. But another thing has to do with, convenience. So, for example, there was a group of prisoners in Pennsylvania about 10 years ago who created a new religion. And part of that religion said that you would have to eat filet mignon steak and wine for every meal. So they sued and said, our prison system is not allowing my religious freedoms and is not giving me steak and wine for every meal. Now, the thing is, this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said there can be limits to your religious freedom, as in this case, while you at home could do that fine, if you don't know how much filet mignon is, that's really expensive. And that creates an undue problem for the jail system. Another example, though, of a compromise with this has to do with Sikhs and Muslims. What happens is that a lot of men choose not to shave their beard because Muhammad had a beard, and it's a way of relating to that prophet. And so what they did is they had a lawsuit that prisoners were being told that they had to shave their beards because they didn't want contraband in it. Now, the Supreme Court had to decide this. Number one, it's a safety issue, right? People do, a lot of times, hide things in their hair, in their beards, not just Sikhs and Muslims, but everybody. So they had to make a decision. So what they did is an agreement. You can keep it under 3 inches of your beard, and you have to shave everything off. And that was a compromise of this religious rights. But let's talk about school. This is a really good one. Who wants to be made fun of and picked on? Right here. You're the first one. Now, we would like to say that this person does not do this, and he probably would never do this. This is not a judge of his character. Okay? But let's pretend that I'm sitting here teaching today, and I say something that he disagrees with about political opinions. And he decides to stand up, and he says, Miss Ray, you are a, insert swear words here, blank, 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 and walks out. Right? Now, some of us might be concerned and maybe like, maybe he should go to Mr. Bingham's office. So we send him down to Mr. Bingham's office. Mr. Bingham sits him down. He says, you can't punish me. I have my freedom of speech. Right?
No.
Do you guys have freedom of speech in school?
No.
But it's in the Constitution. Isn't that protected? But why?
Because you're not a citizen while in school.
Well, no. You still have rights. No. Okay, that was the one you've gotten wrong today. But let me explain instead what you have. So when you guys pay your student fees, if you guys have a plan, and you don't have to pull out a planner, but your planner actually says all the student rules. When you pay your student fees and you agree to come to this school, you agree to those rules. And those rules can include things like no swearing, no drugs, things like that. You also... don't swear to teachers or whatever it could be. This also applies to the search and seizure laws. This happens all the time. I had a circumstance at my last school where I had a student that had about 5 pounds of cocaine in his bag. What? Yeah, that was an interesting day for me. But regardless, though, we took that bag, brought it into the principal's office, and he says, I don't care because I have search and seizure protection by my Fourth Amendment rights, and you can't look in my bag. You lose those at your school. That's why they can search your locker, your bags at any time. So you agree to abide by those rules. Let me give another example, for instance. Somebody pick a business that's not a school. AT&T, great. Let's pretend that I decide teaching's not for me and I go full-time at AT&T. And I decide while I'm sitting there that I'm going to tell a customer to F off, let's say. Now, can I get fired for that? Yes. But isn't that protected by my freedom of speech? No. Because when I sign up for that job, I agree that I'm going to abide by those rules. Now, this is why, for example, though, with freedom of speech, if you go to, let's say, a public park and you're hanging out with your friends and you accidentally let out a swear word, because I know you guys would never do that. But let's say you accidentally let it out, the police can't just come and arrest you and say, you're violating this. Now, if you make a public nuisance, like showing up at a wedding and screaming at people, that's a little different. Does that make sense? But another example, too, is what happens if you're, let's say, off campus, but you're still representing the school. For example, on a field trip. Now, this was actually a Supreme Court case that happened up in Alaska. Up in Alaska, the 2002 Olympics were happening, and they were carrying the torch along the street next to the school. The school decided that they were going to let... You're going to want to listen to the story. So they decided to let everybody out of the school and stand along the street to watch the Olympic torch go by. A group of students decided to go across the street, so they were not on school property. They were now on a public sidewalk. They enrolled a nice banner that encouraged the use of marijuana, and they were suspended for 10 days. They were sued, said, I wasn't on school property, but you're still representing the school. It's the same reason why if you do anything illegal or online, like Snapchat, Instagram, or whatever, and you're wearing school stuff, you can get in trouble for it. The best example recently happened up in Ogden last year. A group of cheerleaders wearing their cheerleading uniforms went on Snapchat. Now they say they played back something backwards and it just happened to sound like the N-word. But the video shows them allegedly saying the N-word 5 times in a row. Now, they were kicked off the cheer squad. They sued the school district and said, you can't kick us off because we weren't even on school property. But because they were representing the school, they broke the violations of the team. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, in terms of times, though, when freedom of speech can be bad, but good protecting it. Let me explain what happens here. Following 9/11, a new religion was created called the Westboro Baptist Church. This is out of Oklahoma, has about 500 people in it. Now, their belief system is that 9/11 was the start because that is when God showed his beliefs on the world. And they believe that everything that happens now in America that is bad, every soldier that dies, every terrorist attack, every shooting, is because of America being more accepting to homosexuality. And so because of this, they do what's called a funeral protest. So what happens is when a soldier dies from the war, they go to that cemetery and they put these outside of that funeral home or cemetery or whatever. And so a dad one time of a soldier sued, it goes up to the Supreme Court and he says, these people, there's actually part of the Constitution also says that you have the right to mourn, pretty much with a funeral. And so what happens is he says they violated this, and unfortunately, this was freedom of speech. They were on public property, and they were able to say their beliefs. Now, obviously, we can look at this and say this is bad, right? I think most of us could agree this is really, really bad. But freedom of speech, unfortunately, doesn't choose between the two. You could say swear words are nice words, you still have the freedom of speech. So, for example, let's pretend that we have somebody that is very pro-Nazi and believes anybody who is Jewish should die or whatever it could be. And you go to their funeral and you put up a poster that says, I love all people who are Jewish. The same rights apply to both of you. Does that make sense? As much as it sucks, freedom of speech can be protected. Now, we are one of the only developed nations that does this. Most of Europe actually has a ban on hate speech where you can be arrested for it. An example of this is a student in a German high school last year put on Facebook, they said all people of blank religion should be stabbed and killed. That person spent 6 months in a juvenile detention center for that crime. So, very different depending on the laws, depending on where you're at. So let's talk about the Second Amendment, because Second Amendment's fun, right? Nobody has any opinions on the Second Amendment, correct? Okay, yeah. Now, okay, listen. Now, We do have a second half, which is the militia part of it. I'm just going to focus on the right to bear arms because that's the one that's constantly being debated right now, right? Back 10 years ago, this was not really an issue. Everybody was worried about all these other things. There really wasn't so much of a debate on guns and things like that, really until Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook kind of changed all of that. Now, with these gun things happening in these shootings, people start to wonder about gun control. Now, gun control can be anything. So when we say this term gun control, it could mean anything really small, such as requiring a background check to purchase a gun, or having what's called a waiting period, which is where you say you want a gun, you apply, but you have to wait 2 weeks to pick up that gun. Anything from that, all the way up until an all-out ban of guns, like Australia has, or AR-15 bans, or whatever it could be. Those are all examples of it. Now, I want to focus on Utah laws, so that you guys are kind of aware of like the debates over Utah. One example, for example, is what is called open carry. Now, if you don't know, here in the state of Utah, we have open carry, which means as long as the weapon is visible, you can go into most public spaces, as well as businesses that do not have a posting that says no weapons allowed, and you can open carry a firearm. Now, this is a lot less than concealed carry, and most states do allow this to be able to happen with open carry laws. Texas especially, you'll see a lot of people walking around open carrying. But there is also a lot of debate over it. One of the reasons why it might be a positive, for example, is hunting. If you are out hunting, let's say a deer or an elk, and you have a gun, you wouldn't want to be arrested for having that gun out. On the opposite side, though, there is nothing in the law that says what kind of a gun you can open carry. So, for example, this happened a couple years ago. A guy really wanted to portray his very pro-Second Amendment rights. And so he decided to open carry an AR-15 in the Salt Lake City airport. Now, you might say Salt Lake City airport, I thought you can't have guns there. Anything before security is state grounds. So state laws apply. And while he had several people get called on him for the police, they couldn't arrest him or do anything because he was technically following the law. Now, probably the one that is far more popular is the concealed carry firearm. Now, concealed carry is different. While open carry, you do not have to have a permit for. Concealed carry, you have to take a class. You're put into an FBI database. Your background check is run every single day. And if you think, oh, that won't do anything. I, for example, had somebody that I know. They were in California. They got a DUI. They came back 2 days later. Police showed up at their house, took their permit, shredded it, and said you're no longer allowed to have that in the state of Utah because they're now no longer allowed to possess a firearm. And so this kind of concealed carry, though, also has a bunch of debate. And if you say, does Utah have a lot of concealed carry? It is actually one of the top states in the nation for concealed carry. Gun owners over the age of 21, an average of about 50 to 60% of those gun owners also have a concealed carry permit. In terms of impact here in the state, there's a law, for example, that says any public school, anywhere from kindergarten all the way up to college, you're allowed to conceal carry a firearm on those public school properties. That includes teachers, parents that come in to pick students, whatever it could be. Utah State, about 60% of the student body at Utah State conceal carries at any time, compared to Utah that has only about 5 to 10%. So concealed carry is a really, really prominent thing here. Now, a lot of the question has come up too, especially after Parkland, Sandy Hook, what happens with schools, right? Donald Trump has tried to introduce, but there's like a bunch of stuff going on right now, that he wants to advocate that teachers will actually get paid more to conceal carry at school. So teachers would get like a $2,000 bonus for concealed carry. $1,000? A year, yeah. Yeah. But schools all around the nation are actually starting to train their teachers. A lot of school districts will provide free concealed carry classes. Florida right now has a big debate over whether or not they should allow teachers to conceal carry following the Parkland shootings. They massively restricted gun rights in Florida after that shooting, but this one is one that they're considering allowing to be able to expand that gun rights in order to protect students. Some schools are actually going farther than just arming their teachers with concealed carry. In Idaho, for example, there are several school districts that are very far away from police departments, and those school districts have begun to first, they trained all their teachers on how to shoot guns, and then in the corner of their classrooms, there is a safe that either has a rifle, a handgun, or a shotgun in each of the classrooms. Now, in this case, it was the fear that police take so long to get there because they're so remote that they need to be able to protect themselves. On the opposite side, you have people that say, that's crazy, right? Why would you put a gun into a classroom? Now, a really interesting debate came up when I was at Utah State. with this lady right here. Now, what happened is Utah State had a lecture series where every Wednesday they have somebody come and talk to you about whatever the topic is. This is Arnita Sarkeesian, and Anita Sarkeesian is a feminist video gamer. And so what she advocates for is she advocates for more female roles in video games, as well as a reduction of the sexuality of women in video games. And she was coming to speak, and she's pretty famous in the video game world. But she comes to speak. The day before her talk, there is a threat that goes out on Facebook that says there's going to be a shooting at her speech. Now the police decide there is no threat whatsoever. It's not a danger. They proceed. She says, I'm going to show them that I am not going to bow down to people who are going to threaten me. I'm going to still do this speech, but I don't want any weapons. So you have to have bag checks. I want metal detectors. Make sure there are no weapons coming in. Utah State said, we have no problem. We'll do bag checks. We'll do metal detectors. But if they have a valid concealed carry permit in the state of Utah, we cannot deny them entry into this event. So she decided that she canceled the event. She went on every major news source in the world and put out how Utah State had violated her individual rights. Utah State responded and said, we have to follow the law in the state of Utah. Now, if you don't know, last year they passed a law that at 18 years old, you can now conceal carry a firearm as well. What happens, though, at school? Can you conceal carry at the school if you have a permit here?
No, because we have something in the school.
Yep, exactly. Because you agreed to that student conduct, you can't have any weapons in here. So even if you have a concealed carry permit, you as a student agreed that you wouldn't have any weapons. You also can't enter a business with concealed carry that says no weapons on the door. Most famous of those that are usually in the news the most are going to be Buffalo Wild Wings and Hobby Lobby. They don't allow any guns in there. They always have things come up because police officers will go and eat there. Police officers don't apply to any of those known gun areas, and they'll always have a debate over that comes up. Does anybody have any questions on Second Amendment stuff before we move on? No? Okay. You're saving it? What?
With the open carry thing?
Yes.
If that guy went to the airport and started carrying his gun around, if someone felt like the police couldn't arrest him, but if someone felt like he was threatening them, or if he
you would have to prove that he was threatening. So pulling it up and pointing it at somebody, saying, I might shoot you, or saying, I don't mind if I set off this gun in here, that's different. The rules of open carry, by the way, is it has to be in a holster that is closed, and your hand cannot be on that gun at any time. So what that means is you can't be walking around with it swinging in your hand. It has to be in a holster, put away, and as soon as you take it out, it no longer applies to open carry laws anymore. All right. So let's talk about the Ninth Amendment, which is extremely important for APUSH, probably the most important out of all the amendments. And to really kind of explain this, we are going to give an example. Now, I searched the internet far and wide, and I found a random picture of somebody. So we're going to use this person right here. And I know I found it on Google, guys. It's just random. Now, this random person is very lucky because they have a concert coming up that they are very excited. It's going to be at USANA Amphitheater. And they are so excited because the most important person in their lives, Justin Bieber, is coming. And they have waited so long to be able to go to this concert. Now, unfortunately, as they were busy making their homemade T-shirts and their little signs and things like that for Justin Bieber, they forgot to buy tickets. Now, no worries though. They go to the ticket office on the day of the concert and they say, I want to buy a ticket, but rats, they're sold out. Now, what is he going to do? No. Just listen to the PowerPoint. Now, he has a problem. He wants to see his idol. He knows he's right there. He can hear him singing. And luckily for him, he remembers something very important. His drone is in the back of his car. And so he decides to put up his drone, and he goes and puts it right in front of Justin Bieber and watches the concert. Now, you might not know this about USANA because I'm sure that you've all followed this policy. There's actually a policy at USANA Amphitheater that says you are not allowed to take any photos or videos while in the theater.
I found out.
Which you guys have never done. You've never videotaped any performer or artist in that theater, right?
I've never been to USANA Amphitheater.
Huh?
It was a live feed and not a recorded video.
Doesn't matter. You're technically not supposed to have your phone out to take any audio or visual recording whatsoever.
They actually said you can use your phone. like when I was at the gate, but I got my camera going on. Like this.
Bummer. Yeah. Of the drone? Yeah, that's still. We're just gonna say this. So let me explain. Okay, you guys are thinking way too into this. So, anyways, let's pretend though the Asana Amphitheater. They call the police. They say, "Look, this guy, he's violating our rules. We want him kicked off the property." But luckily, this student, he knows the U.S. Constitution. He's read every part of it, and he says, "There is nothing in my U.S. Constitution that says anything about drones. Therefore, you can't tell me what I'm doing is illegal because there's no laws about drones." Because then it would be unconstitutional, right?
Well,
because is there any mention of drones in the Constitution?
Probably not.
So they can't make any laws, right? What about cars? Are cars in the U.S. Constitution?
well,
No.
Good, so we don't have to have any laws about it, right?
no.
Here's like, I'm confused. Okay? That is what this law is all about. So if you will highlight on your paper, Ninth Amendment, you need to highlight the term elastic clause. That is the nickname which you can use on the AP exam. It means that the Constitution can expand and contract based on modern day. So we're not held to the standards back in the 1700s. We are able to expand and contract based on our current situation, which is why you are allowed to have laws about drones. Now, in this circumstance, what he probably didn't know, because he didn't research the laws in the state of Utah, is that every property that you own, you actually own 150 feet above your property. Which means if he had flown it under that 150 feet, he violated it. If he does between 150 and 200, he is now in open airspace, yay, and 200 above is federal airspace. Yes?
So you said that Usana Amphitheater has a rule against
Yes.
filming while in the amphitheater. He's
Yes.
not in the amphitheater, he's in the playground.
It's all their property.
All their property?
Well, technically, so anything with trespassing is if you are asked to leave a property and you're on private property, you have to leave or you can be trespassed. So if you're asked to leave any private property, even if you feel like you've done nothing illegal, you have to leave it. You can be arrested for it. Now, in this circumstance right here, right, you have that 150 law thing, but this idea of the elastic clause is really important in creating our new laws. The reason why is because we always have new inventions that we have to be able to control in some way. And if we didn't have the elastic clause, we wouldn't be able to. So a great example of what happened is over in Provo, this is what happened in the state of Utah a couple years ago, this guy decided he wanted to spy on his former wife. So he pulled up a drone and he followed her wherever she went. And then as she was in her home, he would set that drone right on public property, by the way, but he had a zoomed camera in that would zoom in on her apartment and he would watch her. Now, at the time, we didn't have laws that said that you couldn't do this with a drone, right? So they had to create laws to fix that. Or with fires, people were putting drones up to tape all the fires, and planes and helicopters were having it hit the propellers, and it was breaking and crashing the helicopters. We had to create laws that fixed that. So as time goes on, we have to be able to learn how to adjust. So things like social welfare programs, there is nothing in our government that says we should have Obamacare. There is nothing in our Constitution that says food stamps are legal, or Medicare, Medicaid, free and reduced lunch. But we expand based on our modern day issues. Does that make sense? Okay. Last amendment that we're going to talk about is the 10th Amendment. You need to know on this one to highlight on your paper is you need to highlight states. This is the states' rights. Now basically what this is going to say is the U.S. Constitution, anything not in the Constitution, is given to the individual states. So a great example of this is going to be education, right? Nothing in the U.S. Constitution says you are guaranteed an education, mostly because women weren't allowed to have an education back then and men hardly did, and yet we still have you guys in school right now. Reason why is because the individual states now make those laws. So a great example is what you're required to learn. So if you don't know, every state has a list of what you guys are supposed to learn in each of your classes. For U.S. history, for example, Colorado has just barely banned that you are no longer allowed to teach slavery in their U.S. history classes because that is anti-American. Down in Texas, you are not allowed to teach rock and roll or rap because that is too controversial and inappropriate for students to learn about. Now, these are what those states decide. Every state is individual based on this. So why then can we have Common Core? Because Common Core is a national thing. Why is it that Utah's part of it? Well, the thing is that they can convince you without forcing you, and that is through money. So, for example, with Common Core, a state that adopts Common Core receives about an additional $50 million in funding. Why that's important? $50 million is a lot of money. So if you adopt Common Core, you get that free money from the government.
So really, it's bribery.
It's not bribery, it's just convincing through money. That's not bribery, right? Now, at the same time, they can take away your money, and this has happened right now with Donald Trump. If you don't know the term sanctuary cities, those are cities that have laws that say as long as you've not committed a violent crime, they will not turn you into ICE, which is the immigration officials, unless you've done something that is a danger to society. And those sanctuary cities have become very controversial with Trump's immigration policy. And so what happened is he told sanctuary cities and states that if your state or your city allows this, all of your education funding will be taken away from the federal government. In California, that's about $250 million that they're threatened to lose if this goes through as a law. And so that's kind of what we're talking about with using money to convince people. Other things with the 10th Amendment is things like smoking. It's why here in Utah you could smoke at 18, can't buy cigarettes till 19. In Hawaii it's 21. Every single state is different depending on where you're at. Now, things that the government made. If you will bracket Electoral College, the Supreme Court, and write down the word agency, these are the agencies that are going to be created in your U.S. Constitution. So legally, you have to have these two agencies. Now, the first one is the Electoral College. And if you start selecting the president, this is how we vote for your president, November every 4 years. Now, Electoral College is a bit complicated, so I will try to explain it in the easiest, most uncomplicated way that I can, but I know it'll still be confusing. So when we vote for people in the presidential election, we have the Electoral College, which you can see right here on this map. Based on the population, every state is given a certain number of electors. This can change every 10 years depending on your population. So if your population of your state grows, they will readjust and take it from other states who lost population. This happened to Utah back in 2010. So we have,
Did we gain?
We gained 2. And California lost 2. So with the state of Utah, we have 6 electors. When we go to vote for a president and you have your ballot, you select who you want to vote for. Most people vote Democrat or Republican. You can vote for other people on the ballot. For example, we had a Libertarian last time that was really popular in the state of Utah that people could vote in. You could also write in candidates, but they must follow the laws. So you do have to be 35, American citizen upon birth. This is most famous because the number one person that's written in is Mickey Mouse. You cannot vote him in. He is not a person. And he's not 35 or a U.S. citizen. So you still have to follow the rules. Kanye West wants to run in 2024. If he runs and is not put on the state's ballot, you can always write him in. I would highly encourage you, though, to maybe think about your choices overall of who you want to vote for. And really think overall, not just voting for the name, but actually look at his political beliefs, okay? Now, here's the complicated part. When you mark that vote, you are actually not voting for the president. You are voting as your selection of who you think should be the president. Then what happens is your electors get together, they look at who voted who, and they say, we think that this person should be the president. Each individual person votes. So technically you don't vote, the electors vote. Now, 99.9% of the time, they go along with what you as a state say. If your entire state goes red, they will go red. The only exception is if in those districts, if let's say one district goes another way, you might have a possibility, such as in Maine, where you can see that little red dot. One elector decided not to vote for Democrat, and he voted for Republican. Most of those people are kicked out of office the next term, simply because they went against what the state wanted. Now, why this gets controversial is what's called the popular vote. So, for example, and this again is a debated thing, Donald Trump says differently, but I'm going to go off of the national statistics. So, Hillary Clinton technically won the popular vote compared to Donald Trump, which means more people, about 200,000, voted for her. And yet she lost because of this electoral system. Same thing happened back when Bush v. Gore, which is a Supreme Court case, which if you take AP Gov, you will learn to love this because it's talked about all the time. But Al Gore won the popular vote by almost 2 million votes and yet lost to George W. Bush. That's where the controversy comes in. Now, the Supreme Court, you need to highlight on this that it was weak. Supreme Court does not become a big thing really until the 1900s. There was bribery, people paying off people to get their way. We'll talk about when it becomes actually official. But the big thing you need to know, and the last thing we're going to do, is slavery. I need you to number what slavery looks like in the U.S. Constitution. So you need to do number 1, regulating slavery. Now we can make laws regarding slavery. Number 2, prohibit international slave trade. Number 3 is the Three-Fifths Compromise. And number 4, states deliver fugitives, which means that if you're in a free state, you still have to deliver those slaves back. Now, the most important out of all of this is going to be a starred term known as, and by the way, fun fact, these are all the U.S. presidents that had slaves, by the way. So if you think slavery wasn't an issue, it was. It was a big issue. All these slaves, George Washington had some of the most slaves out of all the presidents. So you just have to realize it was a very common thing during this time. But Three-Fifths Compromise, you need to start because it is very, very important. Three-Fifths Compromise says that this has to do with population. So if you want to put representation by population, what this basically says is how should a slave be treated? Now, in the South, they want every slave to have full representation. Now, take away the fact that they are property, they don't have any individual rights, and they're not a human, but in representation they are, right? And so they're going to want them to count as a full person. The other side says no, they compromise, and now blacks are worth 3/5 of a person in Congress. This is going to be a really big deal when we get to the causes of the Civil War, okay? Now, really quickly, let me explain your homework. So if you'll look at that little half sheet really quickly. Half sheet. Okay, I have to be really quick because the bell's about to ring, so make sure you're listening very closely. This is practicing what you have learned today. A, this is negatives of the Articles of Confederation. Why did we need a new Constitution? B, what is an anti-federalist and a federalist? Why were people debating it? And 3, what is one result of the Constitution? Think agencies, Three-Fifths Compromise, amendments, anything along those lines. You can use your notes. Work really hard to work on this writing so that you can be able to improve your SAQs, especially in this class. Hint, hint. Make sure you come and retake your SAQs, especially if you got a 0, okay? All right. Good job.